He used his last strength to cling to my leg. A Doberman puppy's plea. The Dallas sun fell like a red-hot hammer, striking the pavement beneath my feet in brutal, deliberate blows, and the heat sliced every breath I tried to take, as if the air itself no longer wanted to let me live. Car horns, hurried voices, and the frantic slap of shoes on concrete merged into a dry, chaotic roar that made the whole street feel like a furnace swallowing sound. I was just trying to push through the crowd to reach the parking lot until something brushed lightly against my leg. It wasn't a bump. It wasn't someone misstepping into me. It was a trembling touch, small, thin, so fragile it felt like the wind could have carried it away. I froze. Before I could bend down, I felt it again, tiny claws sharp as pins clinging to my pant leg. Not with force. Not with pain, just a desperate grip from something holding on to the closest piece of life it could find. I looked down, and my heart tightened instantly. A baby Doberman, no more than 1 or 2 months old, was clinging to my leg with the last scrap of strength left in its body. It was so small I could have lifted it with one hand, and its black and tan coat, which should have been glossy, was matted with street dust and broken into rough patches from hunger. Its starved belly was pressed against a stretch of pavement so hot it could have burned human skin. It trembled so violently its whole body shivered like a leaf caught in a storm. But what crushed me wasn't the ruined body. It was the eyes. Round amber eyes lifted toward me, staring as if I were the last living thing in its collapsing world. No bark, no whine, not enough breath left to do anything but look. One single look that said everything. Please, don't leave me here. And then I heard the world around us. Voices flat, careless, cold. Don't touch it, that's dangerous. Sick dog. Who cares, a Doberman? Just let it die, those things grow up vicious. You pick that up, you're asking for trouble. A woman walked past holding her child's hand. When she saw the puppy clinging to me, she yanked the child away. Look at that, disgusting. Move. A guy on a scooter nearly ran straight over the puppy, scowling. Get out of the way, filthy thing. No one stopped. No one looked twice. Dallas just kept moving as if this tiny creature didn't exist. The puppy ranger, though I didn't know that name yet, tried to climb higher, but its tiny paws slipped down the fabric of my pants. It wasn't clawing to hurt me. It was clawing because letting go meant collapsing onto a street hot enough to scorch its skin. I knelt down, and the pavement's heat burned through my pant leg, but what haunted me was the moment my hand slid under its belly. Its body weighed so little it felt like lifting an empty shell. No muscle, just skin and bone. Its breaths came ragged and thin, each one a broken thread, pulled tight by heat and survival. I could hear its heartbeat faint, uneven, almost lost. A part of me wanted to pull my hand back. Logic screamed, don't. It's too weak, it might be sick. Call animal control instead. But then those eyes met mine again. 2 small, wet, terrified eyes holding on to me the way roots cling to the earth in a storm. That tiny grip, its last piece of strength, felt like the final question it still had the courage to ask. If I let go, do I disappear? And in that moment, surrounded by traffic noise and heat that felt like it could melt bone, I understood something more clearly than anything else in my life. If I walked away, it would die right here, on a street 100 people had walked across without ever looking down. I took a long, steady breath. No, I'm not leaving you. I lifted the puppy into my arms, pressing it against my chest, and the heat rolling off its feverish body was so intense I almost lost my grip. But I held on, and from that moment, my life split into a different path. When I lifted the puppy off that blistering sidewalk, Dallas kept moving, as if nothing had happened at all, the cars crawling in a line across pavement, that shimmered like a kiln, while horns bled into the thick air and people brushed past each other like cold, colliding scraps of metal. But in my arms in the middle of that indifferent river of bodies was a life smaller than my hand, shaking in uneven waves. My name is Nathan Hayes, and the truth is, I'm not someone who opens easily. 3 years ago, when the accident took the woman I loved most, and the future I thought was mine, I walked away from the city and everything it once meant to me, trading business suits and dinners with friends, and a life that used to feel bright for an old wooden cabin halfway up the Appalachian mountains. I didn't go there to heal. I went there to disappear. And I almost did. The cabin sat among pine trees that breathed resin into the night, a place wrapped in fog across all seasons where no one came looking and no one called me back. And I lived there with Harper, the 10-year-old golden retriever who had been with me since youth, because she was the only living thing I still allowed myself to love without feeling afraid of losing again. I no longer believed I could protect anyone, and I no longer believed I deserved to be someone others leaned on. That's why the trip to Dallas was supposed to be simple. Pick up some carpentry tools, grab a few supplies, then head back to the mountain. I wanted to go early, avoid the crowds, and avoid the press of people that made my chest tighten. But fate picked that exact moment right there in the crush of strangers to bring Ranger into my life. Inside the truck, the heat clung to my clothes while the tiny body curled inside my jacket felt hot enough to be burning from the inside out. And Ranger didn't sleep, only kept his eyes half closed, the way a child does when they're too exhausted to cry. I listened to his breath short, fast scraped with a wheeze, like someone dragging a dull pencil across the soft walls of his lungs. Looking at him, I found myself asking, why me? Why, out of 100 people out there, did he cling to my leg? I turned the truck toward the mountains without thinking, without weighing anything, with only one certainty. Burning through the noise, bringing him to a Dallas shelter meant he would die because a dehydrated, feverish Doberman puppy labeled a dangerous breed was never going to get a chance. I knew that too well. I had seen it too many times on news boards and rescue bulletins. I wasn't letting that happen again. The road out of Dallas stretched ahead like a ribbon of fire, and as the buildings thinned and the sun dipped behind distant hills, I heard Ranger make a small sound, something like a cry swallowed before it escaped. I laid a hand over the jacket pressed to my chest, cupping the fragile rise and fall of his ribs, and he trembled beneath my touch like a leaf caught against a rattling car window. Bridges, gas stations, neon signs slipped behind us, and by the time the sun dropped out of sight, the road opened wide into mountains, the Appalachians greeting me with mist and the damp smell of grass scents that used to mean escape, but tonight became the shelter of a life smaller than breath. When the truck's tires rolled onto the dirt path leading to the cabin, I saw the warm glow from the porch light, and Harper lying there with her tail tapping softly at the sound of my arrival. But when I opened the door and carried Ranger in, she stopped. Her head lifted. Her warm, golden eyes shifted to caution. I understood. Harper didn't like strangers, and a sick, twig-thin puppy smelling of fever was not what she expected to see. But for Ranger, Harper was an entirely new world. The cabin was a new world. The mountain wind was a new world, one without cars, without scorching pavement, without the disdain of strangers brushing him aside. And I thought I didn't want to admit it felt something shift inside me, too. For the first time in a long time, I felt responsibility. This tiny life needed me. Completely. Absolutely. I set Ranger down on the rug near the fireplace, and the warmth from the flames was just enough to soften the fever burning through his body. Harper sat a few steps away, her gaze fixed on us while Ranger cracked his eyes open and, breathing weakly, still managed to turn toward me, as if afraid I might disappear if he looked away. I whispered, "You're okay now. You're safe. This is home." And in that moment, among the scent of wood and fire and Ranger's fragile breaths, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. This story. It was only the beginning. I remember the exact moment I set Ranger down on the old rug in front of the fireplace, the firelight spilling over his patchy black and tan coat, and revealing dry, cracked skin and ribs so sharp I could count them without trying. He was so small my hand nearly covered his entire back, and his tiny legs splayed out weakly as if they didn't know where to stand to support the weight of his own trembling body. I sat down beside him with a heavy breath. Harper lay in the corner with her head on her paws, watching him with guarded eyes. I understood her reaction. This place had been her territory for 10 years, and an unfamiliar creature, weak, sick, carrying the scent of fever would always trigger a cautious instinct long before acceptance arrived. But for me, Ranger was a much bigger question. I looked at the feverish puppy shaking beneath the firelight, and the voices I'd tried to leave behind in Dallas began echoing through my head. "Don't take it. That thing is sick. It's too little, it won't survive. That's a Doberman. Dangerous when it grows up. Bring it to a shelter. Don't bring trouble home." I swallowed hard as my throat dried. They weren't wrong. Not entirely. I wasn't a vet. I didn't have experience caring for sick animals, and I knew that when something this small depended on me, either I saved it or it died in my hands. I touched Ranger's neck, and the heat rising off him burned into my palm like an open flame, his breaths shallow and fractured, each wheeze scraping the air like a pin dragged across glass. "Ranger," I whispered, unsure he could even hear me. "You've got to hold on." He opened his eyes, a narrow slit, but the look inside them struck straight through me, a look without judgment or fear or blame, only pleading a quiet surrender. No one, not even me, was worthy of in that moment. I realized I was shaking, not because of him, but because I was terrified of failing again. After my wife died, I stepped out of the world entirely and walked through each day like I was wading through ash, keeping Harper close, but refusing to open my heart to anything else. Once you fail someone you promise to protect, the idea of holding another fragile life becomes almost unbearable. I whispered inside my own mind, "Are you sure, Nathan? If this little one dies, can you take that Ranger?" Tried to inch toward me, a movement so slight it was almost invisible, just enough for his front paws to touch the toe of my boot. He didn't whine. He didn't cry. He only touched. The same way he had touched my leg on that Dallas street, except now he was too weak to cling. I curled my hand into a fist, steadying my breath. In that moment I stood at the crossroads of two roads. One, turn away so I'd never hurt like that again. Two, stay and accept that my heart would be tested all over again. I looked at Harper. Her ears were lowered, no growl, no challenge, just watching, and I realized she was waiting for me to choose. And though this cabin had been cold for 3 years, though I had locked myself away from everything the world had placed this tiny, exhausted creature at my feet, as if I were the last warmth it could find. "Okay," I said quietly, the words echoing in my chest. "You're here. You're not going anywhere." Ranger exhaled a small sound so faint I almost imagined it, but his head slowly tilted toward my hand, brushing his muzzle against my fingers. A small touch, not as strong as the grip he had on my leg in Dallas, but strong enough to change the direction of my life. I pulled the small wooden box from the corner, lined it with a soft towel, placed it near the fire, and lifted Ranger gently into it, watching him curl up and shake a little less as the heat reached him. Harper crept closer, her nose hovering near the box as she sniffed once, then again before stepping back. Not growling, not rejecting. It was the first sign. Fragile, but a sign of hope. I sat on the wooden floor with my back against the chair, watching Ranger try to pull strength from the fire and from the fact that I was still there. I knew I had chosen the harder road, But as I looked at that 1 to 2 month-old puppy trembling inside the soft towel, I understood something deeper than reason. He had chosen me first. And I would never walk away from that. I hadn't cared for anyone this intensely since the day my wife left this world. But that night, the first night Ranger spent inside the cabin, I understood a simple truth. If I lost focus for even an hour, this tiny creature might never see the next sunrise. After placing him in the wooden box lined with soft towels, I added more logs to the fireplace, the flames crackling as warm light washed over his tiny face. But even that glow couldn't compete with the fever burning through his frail, trembling body. His breaths came fast and weak, each one slipping out like another fragment of life drifting away. Harper sat a few steps back, eyes fixed on him. She didn't growl, didn't bark, just watched with her head low and ears half raised, the instinct to guard her territory still there, but softened by the understanding only old wise dogs possess. She knew he wasn't an intruder. He was a creature standing inches from the line between life and death, and I was the only thing holding him on the right side of it. I sat on the floor and lifted Ranger onto my lap, his body so hot it felt like cradling a burning coal, and I wiped his mouth, his ears, and the sunken curve of his belly with a warm cloth as he flinched and let out a tiny cry like the sharp gasp of a newborn. "It's okay," I whispered. "You're doing good." I mixed warm water with a little puppy milk, the same kind Harper used when she was young, and brought it to his lips. But Ranger didn't know how to drink, or maybe he simply didn't have the strength, so I dabbed a droplet onto his mouth with my fingertip. 1 second, 2. Then his tongue, no bigger than a thumbnail, touched it once, then again, weak, but determined, the instinct to survive rising even though his body was almost empty of power. "That's it. Just like that," I murmured, my heart pounding, as if I were fighting alongside him. Harper stepped closer and sniffed at Ranger, and I tensed, ready to intervene if she rejected him, but she didn't. She bowed her head, inhaled deeply and exhaled before stepping back. A silent acceptance. He's allowed here. It was the first sign that made my shoulders loosen even a little. By the time the clock struck 10 p.m., Ranger's breathing began to deepen, not easy, but steadier. And the trembling softened as I laid my hand on his chest, feeling the tiny rise and fall like the flutter of a baby bird's wings, irregular but stronger than before. Harper settled beside me, resting her head on my leg, as if she too was keeping watch. I knew the night was far from over. I knew the fever could spike again. I knew puppies 1 or 2 months old, dehydrated and collapsing like this, rarely survived. But I also knew I couldn't sleep. I placed Ranger back in the box, wrapped another thin towel around him, and sat on the wooden floor with my back against the sofa, refusing to take my eyes off him for even a moment, as Harper pressed close, her warmth crossing the boards between us. The cabin, silent for 3 long years now, carried 3 different rhythms, one steady, one strong, and one weak but stubbornly holding on. Near midnight, Ranger shifted, letting out a small breath, soft but clear, and I leaned down as his eyes opened a sliver. Not wide, not fully aware, but enough to see me, enough to recognize me, and inside that narrow gaze was something painfully beautiful. A kind of wordless gratitude only the smallest living beings seem able to give. I pressed my hand against the wooden door to steady myself, my heart beating harder than I wanted to admit. "You're going to be okay, Ranger," I whispered. "Whatever happens, you won't have to fight alone anymore." Harper moved closer to the box and lay down in a protective curve, and Ranger looked at her, his tiny nose twitching as if he was trying to understand the scent of this new family. And for the first time in many years, the cabin didn't feel like a place I hid from the world. That night it became the place where I fought with another life, not against my own sorrow. When Ranger finally closed his eyes, his breathing steadier and warmer, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. We had survived the first test, and another journey had just begun. On the third morning, after bringing Ranger to the cabin, I woke to a faint sound like tiny claws tapping against the wooden floor, and I bolted upright with my heart pounding, convinced he was seizing, or that the fever had surged again. But he wasn't. When I looked down, the little puppy was trying to stand, his tiny legs trembling as if the floor were thin ice. Yet he pushed himself upright anyway, head tilted, left ears drooping softly, eyes fixed on me with quiet expectancy. "God," I breathed. "What are you trying to do, little one?" Ranger staggered a step, then another. Then his whole body collapsed against my leg. To someone else, it might have looked like nothing more than a puppy learning to walk. But to me, it was proof of life, proof that he still wanted to fight, proof that he hadn't given up. Harper wandered in from the kitchen, stretching with a long yawn, but she froze the moment she saw Ranger. Her tail twitched, no longer stiff with tension like during the first days, and she stepped forward to lower her head and touch her nose gently to Ranger's back. Ranger flinched, then lifted his head to stare at the dog 10 times his size. A pause, a slow exhale from Harper. Then Ranger wobbled forward and tapped her leg with his tiny nose. A gesture so small it could break your heart, a tiny greeting from a creature learning to trust again. Harper stepped back half a pace, then sat down beside him. That posture was acceptance. I sank onto the rug, my chest loosening in a way I hadn't allowed in years, because in 3 years of living in that cabin, no morning had made me want to smile the way this one did. And from that day on, Ranger changed visibly. He ate more, drank more, and began revealing bits of his personality, the parts illness and fear had buried. He sniffed everything. My boots, the table legs, Harper's worn blanket, even the fresh-cut firewood stacked near the stove, and though he walked unsteadily, he refused to lie still. Every time he slipped, he looked at me as if checking whether I'd be angry, and when I laughed, Ranger wagged his tail for the first time since the moment I found him. That tail wag. Weak, but determined. A small thank you carried through a fragile body. Harper started shadowing Ranger like an older sister. When he wandered too close to the porch step, Harper's body blocked him. When he rolled off the rug, she nudged him gently back to the center. No commands, no training, just instinct. Harper understood Ranger was learning how to survive, and Harper chose to stand beside him. On the night of the 5th day, Ranger was asleep when he suddenly jolted his head, twitching and his legs curling tight, a soft whimper escaping him, the sound of a bad dream still carrying the heat of Dallas. I leaned down and placed a steady hand on his back, but what stopped my breath was Harper. She rose from her corner, walked over, lowered her head and touched her nose to Ranger's forehead. A single touch, gentle and patient, and Ranger stopped trembling, instantly lifting his blurry eyes to Harper with a trust so raw it hurt to look at. I turned away, swallowing the swell of emotion rising in my chest. For 3 years I had lived as a man with a locked heart. But that night, watching Harper soothe Ranger, watching 2 souls find each other in a dark wooden cabin, I felt something I thought I had lost forever: family. On the 7th day, Ranger barked for the first time. It wasn't loud, it wasn't strong. Just a tiny woof, more like a hiccup than a bark, but he stood tall with his back arched, and his tail wagging wildly as if saying, "I did it. I'm alive." Harper stared, tilted her head, then answered with a warm, low bark. The 2 sounds blended, echoing through the cabin like a signal from the universe. The little boy had come back to life. I sat down and lifted Ranger into my arms, and he licked my hand for the first time. And with that small act, I knew one thing with absolute clarity: Ranger wasn't just surviving. He had chosen to trust me, completely. A week after Ranger began to recover, the Appalachians shifted their wind, and the sky turned gray in that specific way mountain people recognize instantly, the strange, heavy quiet before a storm. I was chopping wood on the porch, each swing of the axe echoing like a dry knock through the thick, humid air, while Harper dozed on the steps with half-closed eyes and Ranger wandered around, chasing fallen leaves as if discovering the world all over again. It took only a moment, just long enough for me to bend down and pick up a piece of wood, and when I straightened, Ranger was no longer in sight. I shot upright. Ranger, nothing. Harper's head snapped up, her ears standing like sharpened arrows. She leaped to her feet, sniffed the air hard, and suddenly growled a low, warning rumble I rarely heard from her. No, don't. I muttered, my chest tightening. I sprinted into the yard. No Ranger. Only tiny paw prints in the damp earth leading toward the tree line before disappearing into the darkness beneath the pines. A cold shock ran down my spine like someone had poured a bucket of ice water between my shoulders. Ranger. I shouted, my voice scattering into the thick forest. No bark, no movement. Only the Appalachian wind curled around the trunks like muffled warnings trapped in the branches. Harper glanced back at me, waiting for permission, then tore into the trees. I grabbed my flashlight and ran after her. Breath burning my throat as fallen leaves exploded under my feet, each crack sounding like my pulse striking the inside of my ribs. I called his name until my voice frayed, but the forest gave me nothing back except my own echo. Images flashed through my mind, a tiny puppy tangled in thorns, a hungry fox catching his scent, or the mountain cold swallowing the last warmth from his body. I yelled again, my voice breaking, Ranger God, where are you? Then suddenly a sound, small, faint, but unmistakable Ranger's cry. I held my breath. Harper bolted toward it. I followed. When the beam of my flashlight swept across a shallow ditch, my heart seized. Ranger was tangled in an old strip of barbed wire fencing. The metal twisted tight around his waist and back leg, his tiny body jerking with each ragged breath as his wide, wet eyes locked onto mine, with the same desperate plea he'd carried the day he clung to my leg in Dallas. Ranger. Oh God. I dropped to my knees. My hands gripped the wire and pulled hard, the sharp metal tearing my skin open as blood dripped freely, though I barely felt it. Ranger tried to lift his head, releasing a sound so fragile it felt like a knife sliding between my ribs. You're okay. I'm here. Look at me, I said, voice shaking. Each pull of mine made the barbed wire shriek with the metallic cry of something being torn apart, and Ranger whimpered a tiny sound that split the night. I shifted positions, using my shoulder to lift both hands to twist the wire loose. Hold on, little boy, just a little more. The wind blasted through the trees, cold as steel. Harper stood guard beside us, head bowed, releasing a single deep bark, not in warning but urging me on. Hurry. I put everything I had into one last pull. The final strand snapped free. Ranger collapsed into me. I wrapped him against my chest, blood from my hands soaking into my collar as his feverish heat pressed against my neck. He nudged his head against me, soft, as the first time he touched my pant leg in Dallas, but this time it wasn't a plea for rescue. It was a plea for me not to leave him. I'm here. I'm right here, I repeated, breath shaking. Harper sat beside us, her steady gaze fixed on us like an old sentinel keeping her silent vow. I lifted Ranger and held him tight, feeling his heartbeat racing uneven, frightened but beating. Being alive means fighting. And as I stepped out of the darkness of the forest, I realized something I hadn't let myself say for 3 years. I was afraid of losing him. Afraid in the way only people who have lost once truly understand. Back at the cabin, I set Ranger on the rug beside the fire, and he lay there, weak but safe, while Harper curled close, resting her head across his back as if offering him a silent oath. I'm here, sleep. I placed my hand on Ranger's chest, watching each breath rise beneath my palm. Every rise was a reminder I had saved him twice. And both times, he had saved me too. That was the night I understood something with perfect clarity. We were no longer rescuer and rescued. We were family. Spring slipped into the Appalachians as softly as a morning breath, the melting snow revealing tender green grass beneath my feet, while the mountain wind drifted through the cabin like a quiet blessing. And 3 weeks after the night I pulled Ranger out of the barbed wire fence, the trembling 1 to 2 month old puppy I once held like a dying ember was no longer the same. Each morning, when I opened the door, Ranger shot into the yard like an arrow. His once thin frame now filled out with small, firm muscles, shifting beneath a glossy black and tan coat, and though he stumbled at first, he eventually found his rhythm, the rhythm of a creature learning to live with its whole heart. Harper watched from the porch with a look both stern and gentle. When Ranger turned back, tail wagging, releasing a high, joyful bark, Harper stepped down and answered with a deep, steady one of her own. The final acceptance. The quiet decree. You belong here. I stood on the porch with a cup of hot coffee in my hand, watching the two of them chase each other across the grass, and the sight was something I never thought I'd witness again, because for 3 years I had lived as a shadow of myself with Harper as the only breath that kept me upright. But maybe the cabin had been too quiet for too long, too few laughs, too many silent memories. Ranger brought color back to this house every sprint, every bark, every time he tripped face first into the grass, only to pop up again, as if he had never learned the word quit. In the afternoons, he liked to stretch out on the porch with his head resting on Harper's legs, both of them staring into the valley while I leaned against the post behind them, letting the sunlight slide across Ranger's soft fur as each of his breaths reminded me that what I lifted from the blistering Dallas pavement wasn't just a dying creature. It was a chance, his and mine. One evening, as a gentle rain began to fall, Ranger tucked his head beneath my hand and curled against me like the tiny pup he once was, while Harper pressed her back to my leg, forming a quiet circle of warmth at my feet. I rested my hand on Ranger's chest, feeling the strong, full pulse beneath my palm. No trembling, no breaking, just life steady and proud. I whispered, unsure of who I meant it for Ranger Harper or myself. You changed my life, kid. You know that. Ranger opened his eyes and licked my hand softly. Harper sighed and lay her head on my knee, as if she had known it all along. I looked out the cabin window, watching the wind push the grass into rolling waves, feeling the weight lift from the sky, from the house, from my chest. Ranger had gotten a second chance, but the truth was I had too. And if you're still here listening to this, you're part of the reason stories like this can continue to exist. We can't save every living soul in this world, but sometimes all it takes is one moment of stopping, one open hand, one decision to bend down the way I did on that scorching Dallas afternoon to change an entire life. Sometimes the creatures we save are the ones who save us back. If this story touched you, leave a comment. Like, subscribe and ring the bell so you won't miss the next chapter of this journey. And if you can support the rescue shelters near you. Because somewhere out there in the rush of this world, another ranger is waiting for someone who knows how to stop.